I never imagined my life would take this turn. But here I am, standing at the edge of everything I thought I knew. My name is Emily, and until recently, I thought my marriage was unshakable. When I first met Mark, it was like a dream. He was charming, attentive, and made me feel like the only woman in the world. We built a life together that everyone admired, at least from the outside. But somewhere along the way, things began to change. Mark became distant, throwing himself into his work, leaving me to navigate the silence at home alone. I'd sit for hours in our beautifully decorated living room, scrolling through photos of happier times, wondering where it all went wrong. Nights were the worst, lying in bed next to him, feeling like there was an ocean between us. Then one evening, as I was restocking our wine rack, I noticed my neighbor, Jake, out on his balcony. Jake had recently moved in next door, and though we'd exchanged polite nods and smiles, we'd never spoken beyond that. He caught my glance and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just harmless attention, but that smile stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I found myself looking out for him, hoping to catch another glimpse. And Jake didn't disappoint. He was always there at just the right moments. A wave when I stepped outside to grab the mail, a lingering look when we crossed paths in the hallway. It was on a particularly lonely Friday night when everything changed. Mark had canceled our dinner plans again, leaving me staring at a table set for two. Frustrated and needing air, I stepped out onto the patio, wine glass in hand. And there he was, Jake, leaning casually on the railing, his gaze locking onto mine. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and soothing. That simple question was my undoing. I nodded, but he could see through the lie. He stepped closer to the edge of his balcony, his eyes searching mine. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." I knew it was wrong, but in that moment, it felt like someone had finally seen me again. Jake's words echoed in my mind long after I went back inside that night. If you ever need someone to talk to, it was such a simple offer, but it carried a weight I hadn't felt in years. An invitation, a lifeline, or maybe something I wasn't ready to admit to myself. The next few days, I kept catching myself glancing toward his balcony, hoping he'd be there. And he was, as if waiting for me too. His presence started to feel like a comforting rhythm, one I didn't realize I had begun to rely on. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues, I found myself back on the patio. This time, it wasn't an accident. Jake was already there, leaning against the railing, a drink in his hand. His smile was instant and disarming, as if he'd been expecting me. "Rough day?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. I sighed, leaning on the railing to close the gap between us. "You could say that. Work, life, everything feels so heavy lately." Jake nodded, his expression soft and understanding. "I get it. Sometimes it feels like no one notices how hard it is just to keep going." It was like he had reached into my chest and pulled out the words I hadn't been able to say. For the first time in years, I felt seen. The conversation flowed easily after that, a mix of light jokes and deeper confessions. I told him how Mark and I had drifted apart, and he shared bits of his own struggles with loneliness since moving to the city. As the evening wore on, the distance between our balconies started to feel like a mere formality. His laughter was warm and inviting, his gaze lingering a little too long when I spoke. It was dangerous, and I knew it, but there was a thrill in that danger, a spark I hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. At one point, our conversation dipped into silence, the kind that's heavy with unspoken words. Jake's eyes locked onto mine, and the air between us crackled. "Emily," he said softly, "you deserve to be happy." My breath hitched, and I could feel the blood rushing to my cheeks. I quickly excused myself, retreating inside before I could do something I'd regret. But even as I closed the door behind me, my heart was racing, and my thoughts were consumed by the man next door. I knew I was playing with fire, but for the first time in years I felt alive. The days that followed were a blur of emotions I couldn't untangle. Guilt, excitement, and longing swirled in my chest, each fighting for control. I told myself to stay away, to keep things innocent, but my resolve was weak. The pull toward Jake was magnetic, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about him. One evening, as Mark sat in the living room engrossed in his laptop, I found myself drawn to the patio again. I told myself I was just getting some air, but deep down, I knew the truth. Jake was already outside, as if he knew I'd come. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Hey," I replied, my heart already pounding. The The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. Finally, Jake leaned forward, resting his arms on the railing. "I can't stop thinking about you, Emily." His words hit me like a thunderclap. I knew they shouldn't have thrilled me, but they did. My cheeks flushed as I glanced down, trying to compose myself. "Jake, this isn't right," I whispered, though even as I said it, my voice betrayed the hesitation I felt. "Maybe not," he said, his tone calm but insistent. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" I looked up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were piercing, full of an intensity that left me breathless. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Before I could think it through, Jake spoke again. "Come over." The simplicity of his invitation sent a shiver down my spine. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and anticipation. "Jake, I can't," I managed, though the weakness in my voice told him I wasn't sure. "You can," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Just for a little while. We'll talk, that's all." I hesitated, torn between my better judgment and the yearning in my chest. Every logical part of me screamed to walk away, but something deeper, a hunger I couldn't ignore, pulled me toward him. Minutes later, I found myself standing at his front door, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. When he opened the door, the look on his face told me everything. There was no turning back now. The moment Jake opened the door, the air between us shifted. His eyes locked on mine, and the intensity in his gaze sent a ripple through my body. For a split second, I considered running, retreating to the safety of my predictable, crumbling life. But my feet stayed rooted, and before I could second-guess myself, Jake stepped aside to let me in. His apartment was modest but cozy, dimly lit with soft music playing in the background. The scent of him, a mix of cologne and something earthy, filled the air, wrapping itself around me like a warm embrace. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, gesturing to the couch. I sat down, nervously clutching my hands in my lap, feeling the weight of the moment. Jake walked into the kitchen and returned with 2 glasses of wine, handing one to me. His fingers brushed against mine as I took it, and the contact sent a jolt through me. "Relax," he said, sitting down beside me, closer than I expected. His voice was calm, but there was a tension in the way he looked at me, as if he was holding himself back. We talked at first, about nothing and everything. Work, hobbies, and the little things we'd noticed about each other over the past few weeks. But as the conversation flowed, so did the wine, and the space between us seemed to shrink with every passing moment. At one point, Jake reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent my heart racing. "You're beautiful, Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Jake, we can't," I started, but my words faltered as he leaned in closer. "Tell me to stop, and I will," he said, his eyes searching mine for permission. But I didn't tell him to stop. I couldn't. His lips met mine, soft at first, testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more consuming. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself melt into him, the world outside fading away. For the first time in years, I felt alive, wanted, desired. And even though I knew I was crossing a line I could never uncross, I couldn't bring myself to care. The kiss was electric, igniting a fire in me that I hadn't felt in years. Jake's hands slid down my back, his touch firm yet tender, as if he understood the fragile weight of this moment. I knew this was wrong. Every fiber of my being told me to stop, but I couldn't. Not when I finally felt seen, wanted, alive. "Emily," he murmured against my lips, his voice raw and full of need. "I've wanted this, wanted you for so long." His confession shattered whatever restraint I had left. I let myself lean into him, my hands finding their way to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath my fingers. It matched my own, a chaotic, desperate rhythm that neither of us could ignore. Jake's hands moved to my waist, pulling me onto his lap. My breath hitched as he held me there, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. But there was none. Not in that moment. The weight of my marriage, my life with Mark, all of it seemed to vanish, replaced by the intoxicating pull of Jake's presence. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, unable to speak, my heart pounding in my chest. The look in his eyes was a mix of desire and restraint, as if he was giving me one last chance to walk away. But I didn't. His lips found mine again, more urgent this time, his hands exploring my body in a way that made me forget everything else. Time seemed to blur as we lost ourselves in each other, the lines we were crossing fading into the background. Hours later, I found myself lying beside him, my head resting on his chest. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing, but the weight of what we'd just done hung heavily in the air. "This changes everything," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jake tightened his arms around me, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "It doesn't have to. We'll figure it out." But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. What we'd done wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a choice, one that would have consequences neither of us could predict. As I slipped back into my house later that night, the guilt hit me like a wave. Mark was asleep on the couch, his laptop still open beside him. I stood there for a moment, watching him, the weight of my betrayal settling heavily on my shoulders. But even as the guilt consumed me, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, about the way he made me feel, about the fire he'd reignited in me. And despite everything, a part of me couldn't wait to see him again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt clung to me like a shadow, but it was no match for the thrill that pulsed through me every time I thought of Jake. Our stolen moments had awakened something in me, a hunger I couldn't ignore. I found myself looking for excuses to see him. A trip to the mailbox that lingered too long. Watering the plants when I knew he'd be outside. Each time, Jake would find a way to close the distance between us. His touch, light, fleeting, sent shivers down my spine, a silent promise of the passion that lay beneath the surface. But at home, things were unraveling. Mark had started to notice my distance. He'd ask questions, simple ones like how my day was or if something was bothering me. I'd brush them off with a smile, hiding the storm inside me. But his eyes lingered too long, as if he was trying to piece together the cracks I was desperately trying to hide. One evening, as I was folding laundry, Mark came into the room. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Are we okay?" I froze, the shirt in my hands slipping to the floor. "Of course we are. Why wouldn't we be?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. You've seemed distant lately. I feel like I'm losing you." His words struck a nerve, a pang of guilt twisting in my chest. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was he wasn't. "We're fine, Mark," I said, forcing a smile. "You're just stressed with work, that's all." He nodded, but the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. As he left the room, I sat down on the bed, my heart heavy with the weight of my lies. Later that night, I found myself on Jake's doorstep again. The moment he opened the door, all my guilt, my doubts, my fears, they melted away. His arms were a sanctuary, his kiss a balm for the chaos inside me. "Stay tonight," he whispered, his lips brushing against my ear. I hesitated, the weight of Mark's earlier words still fresh in my mind. But when Jake pulled me closer, his hands sliding down my back, all my resolve crumbled. I nodded, letting him guide me inside, knowing I was crossing a line I could never come back from. In Jake's arms, the world felt far away, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to forget the life I was leaving behind. The night I stayed at Jake's was unlike anything I had experienced in years. His touch was tender yet consuming, his whispers filled with promises of a world I had forgotten could exist. For hours, I felt free from the expectations, the monotony, the weight of a life that had slowly drained me. But freedom comes with a cost, and I felt its price the moment I walked back into my home. Mark was waiting for me in the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. His face lit up when he saw me, though I could sense the fatigue in his eyes. "You're up early," he said, flashing a tired smile. I forced myself to return the smile, my stomach twisting with guilt. "Couldn't sleep," I lied, pouring myself a glass of water. Mark leaned against the counter, studying me. "You've been restless lately. Is there something you want to talk about?" I shook my head, avoiding his gaze. "Just a lot on my mind, that's all." But his concern was like a spotlight, illuminating the cracks I was trying so hard to hide. And as he reached out to touch my arm, I felt a wave of panic, as if he could see right through me. "I'm here, Emily," he said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it together." His words should have comforted me, but instead, they felt like a knife to the chest. How could I tell him that I wasn't sure I wanted to get through it? That my heart was no longer entirely his? Later that day, Jake texted me, a simple message that sent my pulse racing. "I can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again?" I stared at the screen, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I knew I should end it, that every moment I spent with Jake was another betrayal. But the thought of losing him, of going back to the emptiness I felt before, was unbearable. Against my better judgment, I replied, "Tonight." As the hours ticked by, I found myself making excuses to leave the house. Mark barely looked up from his laptop as I grabbed my keys, mumbling something about meeting a friend. The lie slipped from my lips so easily it made my stomach churn. When I arrived at Jake's, he opened the door with that same disarming smile that made my heart flutter. Without a word, he pulled me inside, his hands finding their way to my waist as his lips claimed mine. Every kiss, every touch felt like a fire consuming me. And though I knew I was burning everything to the ground, I couldn't stop. Jake's hands moved over me with a confidence that both thrilled and terrified me. Every moment in his arms felt like an escape from reality, a fleeting glimpse of a world where passion and freedom reigned over the dull predictability of my life. Yet deep down, I knew this couldn't last. "Emily," Jake whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "I don't want to share you anymore. This, sneaking around lying, it's not enough." His words froze me in place. I pulled back, looking into his eyes. They were filled with longing, but also something else, something heavier. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're incredible, Emily. But this isn't fair to either of us. I want more. I want you. Completely." His confession sent a jolt through me. For weeks, I'd let myself live in this fantasy, pretending the rest of the world didn't exist. But Jake was right. There was no middle ground. What we were doing wasn't sustainable. "I can't just walk away from my life," I said, the weight of my words sinking in as I spoke them. "Mark, he's a good man. He doesn't deserve this." Jake stepped closer, his hands gently cupping my face. "Then leave him. You deserve to be happy too, Emily. Don't you?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Did I deserve happiness? And if I did, was it worth destroying someone else's in the process? That night, as I lay beside Jake, his arms wrapped tightly around me, my mind raced. I couldn't deny how much I cared for him, how alive he made me feel. But the thought of leaving Mark, of tearing apart the life we had built together, filled me with dread. The next morning, I returned home to find Mark waiting for me. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed a storm of emotions. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. Panic set in as I sat down across from him. "What is it?" Mark took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly together. "I know something's been going on. You're distant, distracted. You're not the same. If there's something you're not telling me, I need to know." His words hit me like a freight train. My mind raced for an explanation, a way to deflect, but nothing came. The walls I'd built around my secrets were crumbling, and I wasn't sure I could keep them from crashing down. Mark's words lingered in the air like a ticking time bomb. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The guilt that had been simmering inside me now threatened to boil over. He deserved the truth, but the thought of saying it out loud, of shattering everything we had, was unbearable. I've just been overwhelmed lately," I finally said, my voice shaking. "Work, the house, everything. I didn't mean to worry you." Mark studied me, his gaze sharp and piercing. "Emily, if there's something you're not telling me, I can handle it. But I need you to be honest with me." His calmness made it worse. There was no anger, no accusations, just quiet pain. I wanted to confess, to unburden myself of the lies that had piled up between us. But the words caught in my throat. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Really?" Mark didn't push further, but the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. As he left the room, I felt a pang of regret. How had it come to this? Later that day, Jake texted me, asking if I was okay. His message was simple, but it carried a weight that tugged at my heart. I knew I needed to see him, to escape the suffocating guilt that clung to me like a second skin. That evening, I found myself at Jake's door again. He opened it with a smile that melted away my doubts, pulling me inside and wrapping me in his arms. For a while, I let myself forget everything: Mark, the lies, the guilt. With Jake, the world seemed simpler, even if it was only an illusion. But as the night wore on, reality crept back in. "Jake," I said softly, pulling away. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." His expression darkened, his hands gripping mine. "Then don't. End it, Emily. Choose me." Tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head. "It's not that simple. I can't just walk away from my life, from Mark." Jake's jaw tightened, frustration flickering across his face. "You already have, Emily. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet." His words cut deep, but I couldn't deny their truth. I was living in two worlds, torn between the comfort of my old life and the passion Jake offered. When I returned home that night, Mark was waiting for me again. This time, his expression wasn't calm. His face was tight with worry, his eyes filled with suspicion. "Emily," he said, his voice low. "Where were you?" The question sent a chill down my spine. My carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and I knew the truth was teetering on the edge, ready to spill out. Mark's question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. My heart raced as I scrambled for an answer, but I could feel the truth pressing against my lips, ready to escape. I was with a friend, I said weakly, my voice barely audible. A friend? Mark repeated, his eyes narrowing. Which friend, Emily? The tension in the room was suffocating. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Every lie I'd told, every moment I'd spent with Jake, was building up, threatening to bury me. Just tell me the truth, Mark said, his voice breaking. I deserve that much. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't hide anymore. The weight of my betrayal was too much to carry. Tears welled in my eyes as I whispered, Mark, I'm so sorry. His expression shifted, the pain in his eyes cutting me to the core. How long? He asked, his voice shaking. I couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, silent, as the realization washed over him. Mark ran a hand through his hair, stepping back as if I'd physically struck him. I trusted you, Emily. I loved you. How could you do this? Tears streamed down my face, but I didn't try to defend myself. There was no excuse for what I had done. I never meant to hurt you, I said, my voice trembling. I felt so alone. Mark shook his head, his anger giving way to sadness. If you were unhappy, you could have talked to me. We could have fixed this. I didn't know how, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to tell you how empty I felt. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark turned away, his shoulders slumping as he let out a heavy sigh. I need some time, he said finally. I can't do this right now. As he walked away, the weight of everything I had done crashed down on me. I had destroyed the one stable thing in my life for a fleeting escape, and now I was left with the wreckage. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing. Jake had given me passion, excitement, and a sense of freedom. But at what cost? I had lost Mark, the man who had stood by me through everything. And for the first time, I wondered if it had all been worth it. The next morning, I received a message from Jake. I'm here for you. Whatever you need. I stared at the screen, my heart heavy. I had chosen to cross a line I could never uncross, and now I had to live with the consequences. As I sat there, I realized that no matter what I chose next, someone would be left broken. And perhaps, in the end, that someone would be me.